I never thought my own son would speak those words to me. Not in anger, not in haste, just coldly, as if he were reading a grocery list. "We're going tomorrow, Mom. I can't keep taking care of you." That was how it began, with a single sentence that shattered 40 years of motherhood. I remember the way his voice trembled, not with emotion but exhaustion, the kind of weariness that doesn't come from work or struggle, but from love that has grown inconvenient. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hand tight around his phone, waiting for the message that would tell him it was done, that she was waiting outside. Or the woman he married 3 years ago. The woman who smiled at me like I was a burden disguised as a blessing. I wish I could say I argued, that I screamed or begged him to remember all the nights I stayed awake for him, all the mornings I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. But I didn't. Because there's something about age. It teaches you that silence often says more than any words can. So I stood there in that kitchen, my hands still wet from washing his daughter's breakfast dishes, and I just nodded. The smell of burnt toast lingered in the air, and for a moment, I thought about how every scent in that house had been mine once. Lavender detergent, old coffee, the faint trace of cinnamon from the cookies I baked when he was little. Now it all smelled different. Now it smelled like her. People think mothers stop loving when their children grow cruel. We don't. We just learn to love differently. From a distance, quietly, through memories that hurt to touch. That morning I went to my room, or rather the guest room as they called it now, and sat on the edge of the bed. My suitcase was already half packed from the week before when she hinted that I might feel more comfortable in a smaller place. Smaller place. I knew what that meant. It meant invisible. As I folded my clothes, I noticed my hands shaking. They weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking because I was remembering all the times I carried that boy when he was too tired to walk, when he'd cry in my arms and say, "Don't let me go, Mama." And now he was the one letting go. Inside I heard her voice. Sharp, controlled. Sweet only when she knew he was listening. She told him she'd found the perfect nursing home. He didn't respond. Just silence. The kind of silence that means agreement. I felt something inside me sink, but I stayed calm. Because even in that moment, humiliated, discarded, I knew something they didn't. They thought they were ending my story. But I had only just begun writing the part where I remembered who I was before I was their caretaker. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking out at the garden I had planted the year Daniel, my son, bought this house. Every flower had a memory attached to it. The roses were for his late father, who promised me once that love, like roots, only grows deeper in darkness. The lavender was for his wife, she said it helped her sleep. And the lilies? The lilies were for me. White, simple, often overlooked, but still standing. The moon was high, the air thick with the scent of soil and quiet disappointment. I realized then that I wasn't sad. Not exactly. I was mourning. Mourning a version of motherhood I could no longer return to. In the morning I dressed neatly. Wore the same pale blue sweater Daniel had given me one Christmas years ago when he still cared to choose things himself. I made the bed, tidied the nightstand, and left the room spotless. When they came downstairs, their suitcases were already by the door. My granddaughter ran up to me, her little arms wrapping around my legs. She didn't understand. She just whispered, "Bye, Grandma." I kissed her forehead and smiled, even though my heart was breaking. Children always see love clearer than adults do. Daniel avoided my eyes. His wife held the car keys and said something about traffic. And just like that they were gone. No goodbye hug. No promise to visit. Just silence again. I stood at the doorway long after their car disappeared down the road. The wind was cold that morning, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own world. But as I turned back inside, something caught my eye. An envelope on the counter, my name written in Daniel's handwriting. Inside there was a check. A small amount, barely enough to rent a modest room for a few weeks. And a note. "Mom, please understand. It's for the best. For the best." Those words haunted me the entire day. The best for whom? I folded the note carefully, tucked it into my pocket, and sat down in the chair by the kitchen window. The same chair I used to rock him in when he had fevers, when he needed his mother's arms more than anything. The world outside looked peaceful, ordinary. A bird sang on the fence. But inside I could feel it. The air had changed. Something was ending. Something else was waiting to begin. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the day my life fell apart. It was the day I started remembering who I used to be before they made me forget. That night, when I lay in bed at the small apartment I rented near the pier, I made myself a quiet promise. I would not cry for someone who saw my love as a burden. I would not beg for a place in a home I had helped build. And I would not live the rest of my life waiting for people who had already left me. Because I had been many things. A wife, a mother, a caretaker. But before all that, had been me. And she was still here, quiet, patient, waiting to be remembered. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. Because even when they told me I was no longer needed, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They might have walked away from me. But I was done walking away from myself. The days that followed felt like moving through fog. Not the kind that drapes over mountains or lingers after rain, but the kind that settles inside your chest, making every breath feel heavy, uncertain. My new apartment was small, a single bedroom with pale walls and windows that faced the sea. The rent wasn't much, but every dollar I spent reminded me that I was paying for something I once gave freely. Peace. The first morning I sat on the balcony with my tea, listening to the waves. For a brief moment, I pretended I was just an old woman who had chosen solitude, who had wanted quiet mornings and soft sunsets. But then reality returned. I hadn't chosen this silence. It had been given to me, like a punishment wrapped in politeness. I kept my phone close, half expecting a call. Maybe Daniel would realize what he'd done. Maybe he'd remember who I was to him before she came along. But the days turned to weeks, and the only message I received was a bank notification. Another small transfer labeled, for groceries. No words. No warmth. Just obligation. Loneliness has a sound. It's the hum of the refrigerator at midnight, the creak of an empty chair, the echo of your own footsteps reminding you that no one else is home. I filled my days with small things. Baking, knitting, walking along the pier. People greeted me politely. But no one knew my story. No one knew that I was a mother who had been quietly erased. Sometimes I'd pass by young couples with children, and I'd feel that familiar sting, the ache of remembering what love looked like before it grew cold. I'd see mothers holding their toddlers, their faces tired but content. And I'd think about the way Daniel used to hold my hand when he was little. His tiny fingers clutching mine like he was afraid the world might steal me away. Funny how life works. It's never the world that takes you away. It's the people you love who sometimes do. One evening, I was at the grocery store when I saw a familiar face. A friend of Daniel's from college, Mark. He looked surprised to see me there alone. He asked how I was doing, how Daniel was. I smiled, said everything was fine. Old habits die hard. Mothers lie with kindness. But as he spoke, something slipped. He mentioned Daniel's new investment. Property, he said. Near the same town where I used to live. My heart paused. That was my house. The one I'd sold years ago to help Daniel with his first mortgage. Mark kept talking, unaware of the storm building behind my calm expression. He said Daniel had used the money to renovate, something about setting up a new life. New life. When I walked home that night, the world felt heavier. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just quietly broken. Because suddenly, I understood something cruelly simple. He hadn't just moved on. He had rewritten our story without me in it. The cracks began to show in small, sharp ways. Daniel stopped calling altogether. His wife posted smiling pictures online. Dinners, vacations, expensive gifts. Always captioned with words like grateful and blessed. Not a single mention of me. It was as if I had died, and they were already celebrating the inheritance. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done in years. Not to vent but to remember. Because when life starts erasing you, writing becomes an act of survival. In that journal, I wrote down the first lie they told me, the first silence that replaced love, the first moment I realized that kindness had turned into weakness. Each page felt like a small step toward something. I didn't know what yet, but I felt it coming. Shift. Reckoning. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from my lawyer. An old friend, retired now, who handled the sale of my late husband's business years ago. He wrote that he had been going through some old files and found something important, a joint property deed that I had forgotten about. The house wasn't entirely Daniel's. Half of it still legally belonged to me. I read that line over and over. Half of it was mine. Half of everything he thought he owned was still tied to my name. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. But for the first time in months, I felt something like balance return to my chest. That night, I dreamt of my late husband, Thomas. He was sitting on the porch of our old house, the one with the creaky swing and the apple tree he planted the year Daniel was born. In the dream, he didn't speak, just looked at me the way he used to when I was overthinking. His eyes calm and knowing. When I woke up, I realized what that look had always meant. It wasn't pity. It was permission. Permission to fight for myself again. The next morning I made tea, sat by the window, and let the sunlight wash over me. Something had shifted. I wasn't just waiting anymore. I started gathering old documents, receipts, photos, everything that tied me to the life I'd built, the home I'd helped pay for. Not out of spite but out of dignity. I wasn't planning revenge. I was simply reclaiming what I had never stopped deserving. Respect. It's strange how peace often begins in quiet defiance. That morning, as I placed the papers neatly in a folder, I whispered to myself. He may have forgotten who I am, but I haven't. Over the next few days, the sea outside my window seemed to change color, from gray to silver, from dull to alive. I took longer walks. I smiled at strangers. I even baked a pie and shared it with my neighbor, an old widow named Clara who liked to talk about her garden. She told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Sometimes, dear, people mistake our kindness for weakness. They only learn later. It was strength all along." That night, I wrote her words at the top of my journal, because for the first time I understood them. A few weeks later, Daniel called. His name on the screen made my hands tremble. Had been months. When I answered, his voice was calm but careful, the way people sound when they need something. He said there were some financial complications with the house. He needed my signature on some papers. I said I'd think about it. And I meant it. 'Cause now the story was changing. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he left behind wasn't the same one waiting by the window months ago. He thought I was fragile. He thought I was forgotten. But I was neither. And deep down I knew. The moment he asked for my help was the moment he gave me back my power. That night I looked out at the sea again. The moonlight shimmered like silver thread over the water, weaving calm through the chaos. And I smiled softly to myself. Because I knew. Soon, very soon, the tides were going to turn. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of day that feels like it doesn't belong to any season. Gray sky, soft wind, the world moving too fast while I moved too slow. Daniel had called earlier that week about those papers. His voice had been measured, polite, and distant, like someone speaking to a stranger in line at the bank. He said he'd drop by to clarify a few details. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't about clarification. It was about control. When he arrived, he didn't come alone. His wife, Melissa, followed behind him. Heels clicking, perfume flooding the small space of my living room. She smiled that tight, glossy smile people wear when they've already decided you're irrelevant. I noticed she didn't sit down. She didn't have to. Her body language said everything. We're here to get this done. They spoke for a while, about property, about legal things, about how complicated shared ownership could be. But I wasn't listening to the words. I was listening to what wasn't being said. There was no warmth in Daniel's tone, No pause when he looked at me. No flicker of the boy I once raised. Only cold efficiency. And that was the moment it hit me. He wasn't confused or manipulated anymore. He had chosen this. When he slid the papers across the table, my hands didn't move. I stared at the place where my name was printed. Margaret Ellis, co-owner. Beneath it, a blank line waiting for my signature. Melissa tapped the paper with her manicured nail. "It's just a formality," she said, smiling. "Just a formality." I looked up at my son, my boy, and for a brief second I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt. Not love. Fear. The kind of fear that only appears when someone knows they're crossing a line they can't uncross. I didn't sign. I told them I'd think about it. Melissa exhaled sharply, like she'd expected resistance but wasn't used to hearing no. Daniel avoided my eyes as they left. When the door closed behind them, the silence was unbearable. I felt the air leave my body, slow, shaky, unwilling. And for the first time since Thomas died, I cried. Not because of loss, but because of realization. Because I understood, finally, that my son wasn't coming back. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, the sea too loud. I made tea just to keep my hands busy, but even the sound of the kettle reminded me of him. The way Daniel used to hum as a child, the way he'd sneak into the kitchen before school for extra toast. Those small memories cut deeper than any betrayal could. I walked to the small cabinet where I kept Thomas's old files. Dusty envelopes filled with years of paperwork, life insurance, business deeds, notes scribbled in his handwriting. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that my instincts were pulling me toward something. And then I found it. A letter, yellowed with time, sealed but never mailed. Addressed to me in Thomas's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside there were only a few lines. "If anything ever happens to me, remember. I left things in your name for a reason. Don't let anyone take what you built. The house is yours as much as mine. Protect it and protect yourself." It felt like hearing his voice after all these years. And suddenly everything came into focus. The property Daniel was trying to make me sign away. It wasn't his inheritance. It was my security. Thomas had known what kind of world we lived in. He'd known that someday, kindness might be mistaken for surrender. I sat there for a long time, staring at that letter, feeling both loved and betrayed at once. Loved by the man who had planned ahead for me. Betrayed by the son who had forgotten what that love meant. The next morning, I took a bus to the old neighborhood, the one Daniel now called his property. The moment I saw the house, I froze. The once white fence was painted black. The garden was gone, replaced by gravel and potted plants that looked like they were chosen from a magazine. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a product. Through the large window, I could see realtors moving about, measuring, writing notes, snapping photos. They were preparing to sell it. He hadn't even waited for my decision. A rush of cold spread through me. My hands tightened around the strap of my bag. Not from rage, but from something deeper. Finality. I stood there on the sidewalk, invisible among strangers. And in that moment I realized, they weren't just selling the house. They were erasing the past. Erasing me. I walked away before anyone noticed. My heart was too tired to break again. On the bus ride home, I watched the sea out the window. It shimmered faintly under the afternoon sun. Calm, distant, endless. And in its reflection, I saw something that startled me. A woman who looked nothing like a victim. A woman who had survived too much to crumble now. By the time the bus reached my stop, my mind was clear. I wasn't going to beg for respect. I wasn't going to fight for love. But I would protect what was mine, the way Thomas had once protected me. That evening I called my lawyer friend again. I told him everything about the visit, the papers, the renovations. He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed and said softly, "You know, Margaret, you could take this to court. You still have legal claim. But I think there's another way." Another way. Those two words echoed in my head long after the call ended. Because I already knew what he meant. Sometimes, Justice doesn't come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from patience and silence. Over the next few days, I went about my life as if nothing had happened. I watered the plants. I walked to the market, baked bread. But behind that calm routine I was preparing, carefully, quietly. I gathered documents, arranged meetings, and made calls to a few old friends in real estate. People who owed me small favors from the years when Thomas and I still ran our firm. Every step I took, I could hear my son's voice echoing from that day. "We're going tomorrow, Mom. I can't keep taking care of you." And every time I heard it, I smiled. Because soon he would realize the truth. I had never needed him to take care of me. The day the papers went public, Daniel's face must have gone pale. He had been ready to finalize the sale, only to find out the listing was blocked. The property was legally frozen pending a claim from the co-owner. I didn't gloat. I didn't even call him. Instead, I sat on the balcony, sipping tea, feeling the wind move gently through the curtains. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting to be loved or understood. I was simply standing on my own side again. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Betrayal hurts less when you understand it's just love misplaced. But one day, the ones who hurt you will face the reflection they tried to avoid, and they'll see you standing there, quietly unbroken." I didn't plan revenge. Not in the way people imagine it. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, no papers thrown across a courtroom table. I'd lived long enough to know that some justice doesn't make noise. It unfolds quietly like dawn after a storm, soft, unstoppable, and merciless in its own gentle way. When I learned the sale was frozen, I knew it wouldn't take long before Daniel came running. People who act out of greed are predictable. They panic when control slips through their fingers. Sure enough, 2 days later my phone rang. His name flashed across the screen. "Daniel." I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. His voice trembled under forced calm. He asked about the claim, about the misunderstanding. But I heard something else beneath the words. Desperation. He'd made promises to buyers, maybe even taken money. And now everything was crumbling. I didn't argue. I told him the truth in the simplest words I could find. That the house wasn't his alone. That his father had left me protection, not property. That I was done being erased. He tried to interrupt, but I spoke over him, my voice steady. I said, "You can sell your dreams, Daniel, but not my memories." Then I hung up. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The world outside was painted in soft gray, the air damp with salt from the sea. I sat by the window with my tea, watching the light stretch across the horizon, and thought about how endings rarely look like endings. Sometimes they look like beginnings, quiet, almost invisible. I called my lawyer friend and told him to move forward with the legal claim. Then I made another call, one that surprised even me. To a charity organization that built shelters for single mothers and the elderly. I asked them if they ever needed property donations for community housing. They said they did. I told them I might have something for them soon. By the time the sun was high, I had made my decision. If Daniel wanted to treat the house like a transaction, I would make sure it became something no money could touch. A week later, Daniel showed up at my apartment. He looked tired, his suit wrinkled, his face lined with worry. Melissa didn't come with him this time. That told me more than words ever could. He stood there for a moment, searching for the right tone, the right excuse, the right version of himself that could still fool me. But I'd seen every side of him. The boy who used to cry when his toy broke, the man who stopped calling after his wedding, the son who left me behind. There was nothing left to hide. He asked if we could talk. I nodded and motioned for him to sit. He started explaining how stressful life had been, how much pressure he'd been under, how he didn't mean for things to go so far. I listened in silence. Because silence is the sharpest mirror. It forces people to hear themselves. When he finished, he asked what I wanted. His voice cracked on the word want, as if he was still trying to understand that the woman in front of him had any power left to want something. I told him I didn't want money, nor apologies, nor explanations. I told him I wanted peace, the kind that doesn't depend on someone else's guilt. He didn't understand. Not yet. Then I told him what I had done. That I had reclaimed my share of the property. That I had transferred my portion of ownership, every inch, every brick, every corner of that house, to a women's shelter. A home for those who had nowhere else to go. The paperwork was already signed. His mouth fell open, his eyes wide with disbelief. He whispered something, maybe my name, maybe a curse, I couldn't tell. I simply said, "You can keep your half. Do whatever you want with it. But mine belongs to someone who still believes in home." He left without another word. That night I sat alone again, but the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of closure. The sea outside shimmered under the moonlight, and I thought of Thomas, of how he would have smiled at what I did. He always believed in fairness, in decency, in quiet courage. He used to tell me, "Justice doesn't always roar, Margaret. Sometimes it just breathes." And I finally understood what he meant. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the charity. They sent a photo, a group of women and children standing outside the house, smiling. The old garden had been replanted. Flowers bloomed where gravel once lay. The porch swing had been fixed, painted white again. In their eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, hope. And I realized I hadn't lost a home. I'd simply given it a new heartbeat. As for Daniel, word spread that his half of the house was worthless without full ownership. No buyer wanted a property split in two. He'd have to buy my share back, but it was already gone. He was left with bricks, not belonging. He tried to call me once more, maybe to apologize, maybe to lash out. I didn't answer. Because forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always require a conversation. Sometimes, forgiveness is letting someone live with the weight of what they've done. Months passed. My apartment by the sea began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. I planted herbs on the balcony. I painted the walls a soft blue. I started smiling again, not out of happiness but out of peace. Every evening, I'd watch the sun dip into the horizon and whisper a quiet thank you. For endings, for lessons, for strength that didn't need to shout. One night, as I closed my journal, I wrote something I never want to forget. People think revenge is fire. But sometimes it's water, calm, deep and certain. It doesn't burn. It drowns everything false until only truth can breathe. When I went to bed that night, I dreamt of Daniel as a child again. He was sitting on the porch swing beside Thomas, laughing. For a moment, everything was the way it used to be. The wind, the warmth, the smell of apple blossoms. But when I looked closer, Daniel turned toward me. Not as a boy, but as a man, older, softer. He looked like he finally understood. And when I woke up, I didn't feel sadness anymore. Just release. It's been almost a year now since I last saw Daniel. The sea still sings the same songs outside my window, but something in me has changed. The kind of change you don't notice until one morning, you realize your hands have stopped shaking when you think of the past. The anger faded first. It didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved slowly, the way winter gives way to spring. Some mornings I'd still wake up with tears in my eyes, remembering the sound of his voice, the weight of that final sentence. "We're going tomorrow, Mom. I can't keep taking care of you." But the ache no longer controlled me. It had softened into something quieter. Understanding, maybe. Or wisdom. I walk by the shore most evenings now. The same path I once used to take with Thomas when life felt simple. When Daniel was still a little boy who believed the world began and ended with his mother's embrace. I can still see his small hand in mine, the way he used to chase the tide and turn to make sure I was watching. That memory hurts, but not in the way it used to. Now it feels like proof that love existed, that it was real once, even if it didn't last the way I hoped it would. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what I did, giving away my half of the house. Tell them no. Because regret belongs to those who wish to undo things. You don't. That house no longer stands for betrayal to me. It stands for something purer. The strength to let go before bitterness becomes your only company. The women who live there now send me letters every few months. They call it Haven House. They planted roses in the front garden, where I once grew tulips. They built a swing for the children. And every photo they send feels like sunlight breaking through an old wound. The world took something from me, but I gave something better back. That realization healed me more than revenge ever could. Daniel called once after that, just once. I saw his name on my phone, and for a moment, my hands trembled the way they used to. But when I answered, his voice wasn't proud anymore. It was small. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything. He just said, "I hope you're okay, Mom." And I said, "I am." That was all. 3 words, simple, ordinary enough. Because forgiveness isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just release. It's the quiet acceptance that not everyone will understand the depth of your love until it's too late. I spent so many years believing that motherhood meant giving everything: time, energy, patience, even identity. But now I know that love, real love, doesn't erase you. It honors you. And when it doesn't, you have the right, no, the duty, to stand up and reclaim yourself. I used to wonder why life waited until old age to teach certain lessons. But maybe it's because youth is too loud to hear the quiet truths. The truth that sometimes you save people by walking away. The truth that strength isn't about how much pain you can bear. It's about knowing when to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. A few weeks ago, I went to visit Haven House. They didn't know who I was at first, just an old woman standing at the gate. But one of the volunteers recognized me from the newspaper article they'd written when the donation became public. She smiled, led me inside, and handed me a cup of tea. The house was filled with laughter. Children running through the halls, women sharing stories, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. And I realized, standing there, that this was the sound of healing. The same walls that had once held greed now held gratitude. The same roof that once covered selfishness now sheltered love. I walked to the garden, where roses bloomed under the sunlight. The wind brushed against my face, and I swear for a second I felt Thomas's presence beside me, like a whisper carried through time. I looked up at the porch swing and thought of Daniel as a little boy. For the first time in a long time, I smiled without pain. When I came home that evening, the apartment felt different, lighter, like the past had finally released its grip on me. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and opened my journal one last time. The pages were filled now. Every memory, every lesson, every piece of heartbreak that had shaped me. But as I turned to the last page, I hesitated. There was one thing left to write. So I wrote this. Maybe this is what growing old truly means. Learning to outlive your own sadness. Learning that you can lose everything and still be whole. Learning that the quietest victories are the ones no one else sees. I closed the journal, set it on the table, and watched the moonlight spill across the room. It was the same moon that had watched over me through every storm. And for the first time, I didn't feel small beneath it. Felt seen. Now, when I walk along the shore and watch the tide pull away, I don't think of what I've lost. I think of what I've learned. That letting go isn't weakness, that peace isn't found in other people's apologies, and that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to start again. Daniel may never understand the lesson I tried to teach him. But maybe someday, when life humbles him the way it does us all, he will. And when that day comes, I hope he remembers that I didn't choose anger. I chose freedom. As I finish telling you this story, I can hear the sea outside my window again. Sounds different now. Not like mourning but like forgiveness. And maybe that's all I ever needed. Because in the end, I didn't lose my son. Found myself. Sometimes, heartbreak isn't punishment, it's protection. Sometimes, silence isn't surrender. It's survival. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply living in peace.